Hello and welcome back to Chapter 2 of Choices. Today we are going to be discussing some strategies that you can use to stay inside the box even during situations that trigger intense conflict. I'm going to switch over to PowerPoint mode. Feel free to go to full screen on the top right corner to see the PowerPoint clearly. So in our first class, we discussed the concept of emotional flooding and the process that happens when we perceive relationship conflict as a threat and kickstart the fight, flight, or freeze response. Today, we're going to talk about that a little more in depth with the concept of attachment. So we understand attachment from our very beginning as infants as a fundamental human need. We need attachment in order to survive. You think of an infant who is helpless and has an instinctive ability to cry and trigger a response from their caregiver to come in and provide whatever needs they have. This is part of the need for attachment. There needs to be an attachment to a caregiver to provide for the basic needs in order to survive. As that baby gets a little bit older, it becomes clear that the infant is reliant on their caregiver, not just for their basic physical needs, but also their emotional needs. Around the age of 6 months or so, the baby starts to identify that they are separate from their mother. And because they are separate, they could potentially lose their mother. And this begins a period of abandonment fear where the baby starts to cry anytime the mother or primary caregiver is out of sight. And this is because there is also an emotional attachment that is a fundamental part of development. And in a good relationship, the caregiver comes and provides comfort, the baby's fear subsides, and they develop a sense of security that their caregiver is reliable and that their needs will be met. This idea of attachment is the basis of a lot of psychological theory regarding our personality, how we grow up, whether we have a basic sense of security or insecurity, and how that shapes future relationships. The emphasis was always on early development and attachment to caregivers. Not until fairly recently that psychologists began to really understand that the need for attachment extends far beyond just our needs as infants and children. Just because we grow up, get jobs, and become self-sufficient doesn't mean we lose that need for attachment. In fact, it simply transfers over into our primary relationships as adults. It was a psychologist named Dr. Sue Johnson who studied this phenomenon of attachments in relationships, began to identify that when conflict happens, there can be a fear that one partner or both for losing that attachment figure. So very similarly to an infant who looks up and can't see his mom and cries and acts out, that in adulthood, in our relationships, when there is a threat to the relationship, people go into what Dr. Johnson calls a primal panic, which means that primal fear of abandonment is activated and people act out in a kind of adult tantrum like behavior, similarly to babies and young children. So when this primal panic occurs and there's a threat to the relationship, this is where it is highly likely that somebody will step outside of the box and engage in behavior that is maybe not even typical for them, but is related to this notion that their relationship is potentially in jeopardy and they go into this survival mode that is activated by fear. So the key is to identify that this is occurring in order to intervene and stop the process. And there are a couple of ways that you can identify stress, whether that stress is caused by this primal panic and threats to the relationship or outside stress. We have a couple of ways that if you're cueing into these warning signs, you're able to identify early and intervene quickly. The first is physical sensations. As the body goes into fight or flight mode and chemicals are being released and blood pressure is being elevated, the body is preparing to survive, there are some physical sensations that you may recognize. These include things like elevated heart rate, face becoming hot or ears becoming hot, physical agitation, tension in shoulders, headache. Those are all physical indicators of the body preparing to go into a situation activated by stress. The second are thoughts. We're thinking about things all of the time. Our brain is always running, but we often don't pay attention to the thoughts that are running through our minds. Our thoughts are critically important because they are giving us permission to act in a certain way or increasing the likelihood of acting out according to the thoughts. So for example, in a relationship conflict, if the thoughts are saying something like, I don't care anymore, he or she's going to get what he deserves, I can't take this, I'm going to show him or her, those thoughts are all risk thoughts that are predictive of future behavior. And paying attention and recognizing those thoughts are critical. The third warning sign, which is sometimes more difficult to cue into, are feelings. So to pay attention to feelings that include things like anger up to rage, jealousy, embarrassment, those are all potentially warning feelings that happen prior to somebody stepping outside of the box. So paying attention to physical sensations, thoughts, and feelings are all cues to help you recognize this process of emotional flooding or even going into this primal panic and indicate to you that some type of action needs to occur before something is said or done that can you'll later regret. So let's talk about this concept of timeouts. A timeout is pretty much what it sounds like. It is a break, but it is a temporary pause on a relationship conflict. And the purpose of this pause or break is not to get out of the problem or the issue, but it is to allow time for both parties to separate and for them to calm down and allow this process that has kicked up in the body and the brain, this emotional flooding to subside so that the emotional reasoning isn't in charge, but rather that critical executive functioning can take back over. Once that happens, for the couple to return and to resume discussing the issue and to arrive at problem solving. This sounds simple, and it's actually not. So it requires a great deal of strategy and coordination and agreement between couple to actually implement this in an effective way. So the most important thing about a timeout is that it is mutually agreed upon. So this requires both parties to be willing to use this strategy during a conflict and stick to it using the tips that we're about to discuss. So if you have a partner who is willing to learn about this strategy as well, I invite you to share this with them, the reading as well as the video, and arrive at some mutually agreed upon strategies for how you would implement this in your own relationship. There are some guidelines or rules for timeouts that are really important to incorporate, because a timeout, if done effectively, is an excellent preventative measure for any type of conflict that has the potential to get out of hand. This is a highly useful tool. If done ineffectively and without these ground rules, timeouts have the potential to make the situation worse. So pay close attention to these guidelines and consider how you would implement them in your own relationship. So the first very important rule is to identify the timeout. And what this means is that you and your partner would have, before the conflict occurred, sat down and mutually agreed upon this idea that when there is an issue and it's getting out of hand, we are going to implement a timeout. And the first thing that you're going to do is to identify it as a timeout. So here's where things can go sideways. If a timeout is not identified and one person just decides to leave, walk out, say I'm out of here, walk out the door, the potential for conflict to escalate has increased substantially. And this is to say that there are numerous cases where the actual escalated conflict and physical incident occurs at a doorway, or as somebody's trying to pull out of the driveway or to otherwise leave. And this makes sense when you think about this idea of attachment and threats to attachment triggering a very instinctive impulse and this primal panic that people go into when they believe their relationship is being threatened. But just walking out the door, saying I'm out of here, is very likely to escalate the conflict. It's very different than previously discussing timeouts and agreeing to use them, noting that the issues are happening, somebody's paying attention to their warning signs, maybe they're getting hot, maybe their heart rate is increasing, maybe they're noticing their thoughts, and deciding at that moment that it would be better to put a temporary pause on this conversation, separate, and then come back once people have both calmed down and can address the issue more effectively. This happens when, number one, it is identified as a timeout and the couple has already agreed to do this. The second guideline is about what you're going to do during this timeout. So remember, timeouts are short periods of time of separation. And depending on the situation, this can be a matter of minutes up to maybe an hour. You don't want to really extend beyond that. But when you do separate and agree to take a timeout, it is important to spend the time alone. Dr. Adams gives some pretty good rationale for why it's important to spend the time alone. Number one is because the purpose of the timeout is for you to be able to de-escalate and get back into problem solving. So by calling a family member, a friend, somebody who's on your side, it is likely that the potential is there that instead of getting you back into kind of problem solving mode, they can support you being upset and further add to that, and maybe not even intentionally contribute to the conflict that's going on. you're not looking for input from other people, people to agree with you and support your position, is not the function of this timeout. It is simply to spend some time alone to be able to de-escalate, kind of return back to your baseline functioning and let those critical thinking skills kick back in. When you do leave for a timeout, you want to specify when you will be back. So you want to let your partner know, again, that this is just a temporary time to get you kind of into a better place to be able to address issues. You will be back in a certain amount of time. So for example, I'm going to run to 7-Eleven, I'm going to grab a coffee, I'm going to be back in 15 minutes. I'm just going to go for a quick drive, I'm going to walk around the block, I'm going to go just sit in the room and watch a movie for 15-20 minutes, and then we'll come back and finish this discussion. So by telling your partner when you're going to be back, you are affirming to them that you will be back, that this is temporary, and again, that the function of this is to get back into solving the issue. It's not to escape it. Next rule that's critically important is that timeouts do not include alcohol or other substances. This is really important, again, because the whole purpose of this is just to restore your brain back to normal and get that executive functioning up and working again. Alcohol diminishes that executive functioning as well. So you have the stress and those hormones. Adding alcohol to that will further reduce your capacity for critical problem solving. It also makes your emotional response more erratic. Some people will say, well, having a beer, drinking a glass of wine calms me down, and then I can get back into addressing the issue. That might be true. There is a temporary effect of perhaps calming down, but again, that impairs the critical executive functioning. The issue with alcohol, though, is that it can have several different effects. There could be an initial effect of a calming sensation, but later, especially under stress, that stress can exaggerate an anger response as well. So your emotional response under an already kind of heated situation is likely to be more volatile, and alcohol adds to that volatility, as well as other drugs. Dr. Adams does a great job of addressing marijuana use and why that's ineffective during timeouts. Because the bottom line is, this is a temporary period of time. The objective is to get back into the game and address the issue. So anything that's going to impair judgment takes away from that process. The final guideline is to return when you say you're going to return, keeping in mind those attachment needs. If somebody needs to have their attachment affirmed, and one way you can do that is if you leave, you come back when you say that you're going to, which helps increase their sense of security and belief of commitment to the relationship and getting back to problem solving. So those are some basic guidelines of timeouts. Very important thing to consider is how you would implement a timeout in your situation under various conditions. So if you have, say, young children, it may not always be feasible for one of you to leave the house for an hour and come back, leaving the other person both upset and then fully in charge of providing care. If you are driving in your car, you may not have the ability to separate and go on a timeout, although conflict happens driving in cars. So what's really important is that you find ways to adapt timeouts to fit your situation. So maybe if you're at home with young kids and you can't leave, or it's 2 o'clock in the morning, a timeout might be going to a different room for a couple of minutes. Sometimes all it takes is a couple of minutes just to restore your normal functioning, calm down just a little bit, enough to be able to resume problem solving and get the issue actually addressed. So here are the goals of timeouts. The first is to decrease some of that emotional reactivity, which is very, very strong, particularly if there is a threat to the relationship or perceived threat of abandonment, and the way that it's being interpreted as a survival threat, and that